My name is Warren Holloway, and for 14 years, I convinced myself that a father earned his place through consistency, not blood. I believed that respect wasn't inherited. It was built one ordinary day at a time through work, sacrifice, and quiet promises that nobody else ever noticed. Looking back now, I understand how badly I misunderstood people. Sacrifice doesn't automatically become gratitude. Sometimes it simply becomes expectation, and expectation has a way of swallowing everything you give until the day you have nothing left.
I spent most of my life in the suburbs outside Boise, Idaho, where neighborhoods blended into one another so perfectly that you could drive through 3 of them without realizing you had crossed a single street. The mornings smelled of freshly watered grass in the summer and would smoke in the winter. Men left for work before sunrise. Children waited for school buses with oversized backpacks. It was the kind of place where everyone waved, everyone borrowed each other's ladders, and everyone believed they knew their neighbors. It was also the kind of place where people assumed they understood your family simply because they saw you smiling on Sundays. They never saw the whole picture. My marriage ended when Logan was still too young to understand why his parents suddenly lived in different houses. Divorce papers reduce an entire life into signatures and percentages. Custody schedules, property divisions, child support. Legal language has no room for heartbreak. It simply tells you where your furniture goes and which weekends belong to whom. I promised myself one thing the day those papers were finalized. My marriage had failed. My son never would. Every decision I made afterward revolved around that promise. When Logan stayed with me, I made sure life felt normal. Maybe even better than normal. We'd spend entire Saturdays rebuilding old engines that neither of us actually needed. We'd fish until sunset without catching much of anything. We'd drive old logging roads through the Idaho mountains with the windows rolled down. Country music humming quietly through worn-out speakers, talking about everything and absolutely nothing. Those are still my favorite memories. Not because they were extraordinary, because they weren't. Real families aren't built during grand gestures. They're built inside ordinary afternoons. I worked more hours than I probably should have. Overtime became routine. Holidays often arrived after 12-hour shifts. There were years when I celebrated Christmas morning after sleeping barely 3 hours because I'd spent Christmas Eve working so the paycheck would stretch just a little farther. I never complained. At least not where Logan could hear me. Children remember far more than adults realize. They notice exhaustion even when you smile through it. They notice calloused hands, grease under your fingernails, boots that should have been replaced months ago. I hoped he noticed something else too, that every hour I worked had his name attached to it. As he grew older, life became more expensive in ways no parenting book ever warns you about. Baseball equipment turned into football gear. School supplies became laptops. Cheap sneakers became driver's education, insurance payments, college applications, and everything else that quietly empties a bank account one receipt at a time. I never kept track. Or maybe I refused to, because keeping score felt selfish. When Logan turned 16, we spent nearly 4 months looking for his first truck. Every weekend we'd scroll through classifieds, drive across Idaho to inspect used pickups sitting in strangers' driveways, crawl underneath rusted frames with flashlights, and argue about whether faded paint mattered more than a reliable transmission. The afternoon we finally found one, his entire face changed. It wasn't new. Far from it. The paint had seen better decades. The driver's seat carried the shape of someone else's life. The odometer had already lived a long story before we ever turned the key. But it ran. Strong. Reliable. Just like I hoped he would become. The salesman handed me the paperwork. Logan looked at me with that mixture of excitement and disbelief only 16-year-old boys can manage. "You really mean it?" I smiled. "I wouldn't have brought you here otherwise." The hug he gave me lasted maybe 3 seconds. Teenage boys don't hug very long. But fathers remember every second. College arrived faster than either of us expected. Acceptance letters covered the kitchen table one spring afternoon, each envelope representing another version of the future. Logan chose the school he genuinely wanted instead of the cheapest one, and I never told him how many nights I sat alone afterward calculating tuition costs against retirement savings. Some investments don't make financial sense. They make emotional sense. Watching your child walk across a college campus for the first time is one of them. Every semester I mailed another payment. Every semester I quietly adjusted my own budget. Vacations disappeared. New furniture could wait. The old pickup I drove developed problems I postponed fixing because tuition came first. Again and again. I never viewed it as sacrifice. It simply felt like being a father. Then Logan met Madison. The first time I saw them together, I understood immediately why he loved her. She was intelligent, confident, quick to laugh, and possessed the kind of effortless charm that makes every conversation seem natural. She asked thoughtful questions, remembered details people usually forgot. The first Christmas she spent with us, she insisted on helping clean dishes afterward despite my repeated attempts to send her back to the living room. "You've done enough," she smiled. It seemed genuine. For several years I believed it was. When they became engaged, I paid for most of the wedding without thinking twice. Watching Logan standing at the altar, nervous but smiling, remains one of the proudest moments of my life. I remember sitting quietly after the reception ended, watching employees fold tables and sweep confetti from the dance floor. I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking that my job was almost finished. I had raised a good man, or so I believed. A year later, they found a beautiful starter home in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. There was only one problem. They couldn't qualify for the mortgage alone. The bank needed another signature. Mine. The loan officer explained every possible risk with practiced professionalism. If they defaulted, I would share responsibility. My credit would be affected. My financial future would become tied to theirs for years. I listened. Then I picked up the pen. Some decisions take seconds because your heart makes them long before your mind arrives. I signed every page, shook everyone's hand, walked out believing I had just helped my son build the foundation of the rest of his life. I had no idea I had also signed myself into the most painful lesson I would ever learn. Madison became part of the family so naturally that, at first, I wondered how we had ever managed holidays without her. She had a way of making people feel seen. She remembered birthdays without checking her phone. She laughed at my old stories, even the ones Logan had heard 100 times before. Whenever I stopped by their apartment to help fix a leaking faucet or replace a broken garbage disposal, she always greeted me with the same warm smile. "Warren, you're always rescuing us." I'd shrug and tell her it was nothing. Most of the time, it really wasn't. I had spent so many years solving Logan's problems that helping them felt as natural as breathing. If a shelf needed hanging, I brought my toolbox. If the car refused to start, I showed up with jumper cables before either of them finished explaining the problem. If an unexpected bill landed in their mailbox, I quietly transferred money into Logan's account before he had to ask. I told myself that one day they would be financially secure enough that they wouldn't need me anymore. That day never seemed to arrive. There was always something: a broken furnace, a medical deductible, a property tax payment that came sooner than expected, an insurance increase. Life has an endless imagination when it comes to finding new ways to empty a young family's savings account. Mine too. Still, I never complained. The mortgage weighed on my mind more than I admitted to anyone. Every month, whenever I reviewed my own finances, my eyes drifted toward the loan I had guaranteed. I trusted Logan completely, but trust doesn't erase mathematics. My retirement wasn't as far away as it once had been. Every year the numbers mattered a little more. Whenever those thoughts surfaced, I'd push them aside. He's my son. Family comes first. That's what fathers do. Looking back, I realize I repeated those words like a prayer. Maybe because I needed to believe them. The first small changes were almost impossible to notice. Madison never criticized me directly. She simply learned how to tell stories. Someone would mention childhood memories during Thanksgiving dinner, and somehow the conversation would drift toward Logan's parents' divorce. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been," one of her cousins said. Madison would sigh sympathetically. "Logan doesn't talk about it much." Then she'd pause, just long enough But he says Warren always had to control everything. The sentence sounded harmless, almost casual. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? I didn't. I assumed she'd misunderstood something Logan had once said. People remember conversations differently all the time. Months later, another gathering, another story, another subtle change. I think Logan spent a lot of his childhood trying to keep the peace, she'd say while pouring herself another cup of coffee. Someone would ask what she meant. Oh, nothing. Families are complicated. Then she'd smile, as though she'd said too much. Nothing invites curiosity faster than unfinished sentences. People filled in the blanks themselves. I noticed the looks first. Friends who had always greeted me warmly suddenly became slightly more reserved. Conversations paused whenever I entered the room. Relatives I'd known for years began asking strangely careful questions about my divorce. Not accusing, just careful, like people approaching a dog they weren't sure would bite. It unsettled me, but every time I considered bringing it up, I talked myself out of it. Maybe I'm imagining things. Maybe I'm becoming too sensitive. Age has a way of making men suspicious of shadows. So I stayed quiet. Then I began hearing my own life described in ways I barely recognized. Apparently I'd been hard to live with. Apparently I'd always needed things my way. Apparently Logan had grown up walking on eggshells around me. Those phrases appeared from nowhere, or so I thought. Each one sounded just believable enough that nobody challenged it. Not even me. What hurt wasn't hearing those stories. It was watching Logan sit silently beside his wife while they were told. The first time it happened, I waited. Surely he'd laugh. Surely he'd say, "That's not how it was." He didn't. Instead, he lowered his eyes toward his plate, cut another piece of turkey, asked someone to pass the gravy. The conversation moved on. So did everyone else. Except me. That silence stayed with me all the way home. I replayed the evening over and over, searching for excuses on Logan's behalf. He hates confrontation. He didn't want to embarrass Madison. Maybe he didn't even hear what she said. Hope is remarkable, can transform silence into innocence if you let it. And I let it. Again. Months turned into years. The stories became bolder, less careful. One Christmas dinner, Madison joked that I probably scheduled Logan's childhood, down to the minute. Everyone laughed. I forced myself to smile too. Logan laughed softly, not loudly, just enough. It felt like someone had reached across the table and quietly removed another piece of my dignity. Still, the next weekend I drove 4 hours to help them replace their backyard fence after a windstorm knocked half of it down. Neither of them knew I'd taken a vacation day to do it. When we finished, Logan clapped me on the shoulder. "Couldn't have done it without you, Dad." That one word. It erased months of doubt. Or at least it seemed to. I drove home smiling. Funny how desperately a father clings to the smallest signs that he still needed. Not respected. Needed. I confused those two things for far longer than I should have. Then came the spring when their property taxes increased by almost $3,000. Logan called me late on a Tuesday evening. His voice sounded embarrassed. "We're a little short this month." He never had to ask twice. I transferred the money before we even finished the conversation. Madison thanked me with a text. Logan promised they'd pay me back. I already knew they wouldn't. I didn't expect them to. Family wasn't a business transaction. At least, that was what I still believed. 3 weeks later, they invited me to Sunday brunch at their house in Coeur d'Alene. I accepted without hesitation. I had no idea I was driving toward the moment that would divide my life into two completely different chapters. I sat in the truck for nearly a minute before getting out. The engine had already gone quiet, but I kept both hands wrapped around the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at Logan's house. It was one of those cool Idaho mornings when the sunlight feels softer than usual, filtering through tall pines instead of crashing down from an empty sky. The neighborhood was peaceful. Sprinklers clicked lazily across bright green lawns. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once before everything settled back into silence. It looked like the kind of Sunday people remembered fondly years later. Families gathering around a table, coffee brewing, children laughing in the backyard. The kind of morning that convinces you life is exactly where it should be. I grabbed the pie I'd picked up from a bakery outside Boise before dawn and walked toward the front porch. Madison opened the door before I could knock. "Warren," she said with her usual bright smile. "Come in. Everyone's already here." She hugged me lightly. If anyone had photographed that moment, they would have seen nothing unusual. That's the strange thing about betrayal. It almost never announces itself. Inside, the house smelled of fresh coffee, cinnamon rolls, and bacon. Logan's dining table was already crowded with relatives from Madison's side of the family. Her parents sat near the windows. A brother-in-law I barely knew was pouring orange juice. Someone laughed at a story I'd entered too late to understand. Logan spotted me immediately. "Hey, Dad." He smiled, walked over, took the pie from my hands. "I'm glad you made it." Simple words, simple gestures, enough to quiet every lingering doubt I'd carried over the previous months. Maybe I'd imagined everything. Maybe families simply go through awkward seasons. Maybe I'd worried over nothing. Hope can survive almost anything if you keep feeding it. I took my usual seat near the end of the table. Madison insisted on refilling my coffee before I'd even taken my jacket off. "You still take it black?" "Always." She smiled. I remembered. Little moments like that make you question your own instincts. How could someone who seemed so thoughtful be saying those things behind my back? Maybe she wasn't. Maybe I'd misunderstood. Again, I reached for explanations that protected everyone except myself. Breakfast drifted along comfortably enough. People talked about vacations, mortgage rates, construction projects. Someone complained about Idaho winters arriving earlier every year. I listened more than I spoke. That had always been my way. I've never needed to dominate conversations. After decades of working around loud machinery and louder personalities, silence became something I appreciated. I preferred watching people instead, listening carefully. You learn far more that way. That morning, I noticed something subtle. Every time I spoke, Madison's relatives listened politely. Every time Madison spoke about me, they watched my face instead, as though comparing two different versions of the same man. The realization unsettled me. Then she began telling another story. It started innocently. "So Logan was telling me about when he was little." She laughed. Apparently Warren believed every weekend needed a schedule. A few people chuckled. I smiled politely. It wasn't quite like that. Madison waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, I'm only teasing." Conversation continued, but she wasn't finished. "You know," she added while buttering her toast, "I think Logan spent a lot of his childhood trying not to disappoint you." Someone across the table nodded sympathetically. "I can see that." Another person added, "Some parents don't realize how much pressure they put on kids." Nobody looked at me. They looked at Logan. Waiting. Again. I waited too. All he had to say was one sentence. "Dad wasn't like that." That's all. One sentence. Instead, he stirred his coffee. Slowly, carefully, without lifting his eyes. The conversation moved forward as though his silence had confirmed everything. Something inside me shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough for me to realize I had spent years defending people who never defended me. The room suddenly felt warmer. Too warm. I loosened my collar and reached for my coffee. My hands were steady, strangely steady. Looking back, I think part of me already knew what was coming. The human heart often recognizes danger long before the mind accepts it. More relatives arrived. Chairs scraped across hardwood floors. Someone poured another pot of coffee. Madison's father asked Logan about work. The conversation circled through promotions, overtime, and rising expenses. Eventually someone laughed. "Good thing Warren's always there to bail you two out." The comment was harmless, almost affectionate. Logan smiled awkwardly. Madison smiled too. Then she looked around the table. She waited until everyone was listening. Only then did she speak. "I suppose that's his way of making up for everything else." Silence. Not complete silence. Just that strange pause where people aren't sure whether something was meant as a joke. Her mother frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Madison sighed, the kind of sigh designed to sound reluctant. "Oh, nothing." She looked toward me, then back at everyone else. "I just think people forget why Logan's parents divorced in the first place." My heartbeat slowed. Oddly enough. Not faster. Slower. Every sound in the room became unnaturally clear. Coffee cups touching saucers. The refrigerator humming. A chair creaking beneath someone's weight. I looked at Logan. He still hadn't raised his eyes. Madison folded her napkin neatly onto the table. Then she said it, loud enough that every person in the room heard every word. "Your father is the reason your mother left." She paused. No one moved. No one breathed. Then came the sentence that ended 14 years of hope. "He's toxic. And everyone knows it." The silence afterward wasn't uncomfortable. It was absolute. I waited. Not for Madison. For Logan. Because the next few seconds belonged to him. He could end it. He could laugh. He could tell everyone she was wrong. He could defend the man who had spent a lifetime defending him. Instead, he lowered his eyes into his coffee and said nothing. For several seconds, I kept looking at Logan. I gave him every opportunity to lift his head, to speak, to remember who I was. He had spent 14 years calling me whenever life became too heavy. He had trusted me with tuition bills, wedding expenses, broken appliances, overdue taxes, and a mortgage that existed only because my signature stood beneath his. I had answered every call, every time. Now I needed one sentence from him. He gave me silence. Madison leaned back in her chair, as though she had finally said something everyone else had been too frightened to admit. There was no regret in her face, no surprise at the cruelty of her own words. She looked relieved, almost satisfied, as if she had been carrying the accusation for years and had finally found the proper audience. Her mother stared down at her plate. Someone near the window cleared his throat. Nobody defended me. The room was full of people, yet I had never felt more alone. I could have argued. I could have told them what really happened between Logan's mother and me. I could have explained that marriages sometimes collapse without a villain, that two decent people can hurt each other simply because they no longer know how to live beneath the same roof. I could have listed every compromise I made, every insult I swallowed, every night I slept on the couch so Logan would not hear us fighting. But explanations offered to people who have already judged you are not explanations. They are entertainment. I refused to perform for them, so I reached for my coffee. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway. The bitterness settled on my tongue while everyone watched, waiting for anger. Perhaps they expected me to shout and prove Madison right. Perhaps she expected me to slam my fist against the table, curse her, and reveal the monster she had spent years describing. I did none of those things. I placed the cup carefully into its saucer. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Then I folded my napkin. "Thank you for breakfast," I said. My voice did not tremble. That surprised me. Logan finally looked up. Only for a moment. There was fear in his eyes, but not the kind I wanted to see. He was not afraid that he had hurt me. He was afraid that I might make the room uncomfortable. He wanted me calm, manageable, silent enough that everyone could finish brunch without confronting what had just happened. That realization hurt more than Madison's accusation. My own son was not protecting me. He was managing me. I stood and reached for my jacket. Madison shifted in her chair. "Warren, don't be dramatic." Those words nearly made me laugh. Not because they were funny, because they were perfect. She had publicly blamed me for the destruction of my marriage, called me toxic in front of relatives and friends, and now my decision to leave was the offense that concerned her. I looked at Logan again. He opened his mouth. For one desperate second, I thought he might say it. "Dad, wait. She was wrong. I'm sorry." Instead, he whispered, "Maybe we should all cool down." As though this belonged equally to everyone. As though my humiliation were a disagreement about politics or football. I nodded once. "That's probably best." Then I walked out. Nobody followed me. The front door closed softly behind my back. I stood on the porch beneath the pale Idaho sun, hearing muffled voices begin again inside the house. They had waited only seconds. The conversation resumed without me, quieter now, but not quiet enough. I could not distinguish the words. I did not need to. For years, I had believed I held a permanent place in Logan's life. I believed every payment, every repaired fence, every late-night drive, and every promise kept had built something solid between us. Standing outside that house, I finally understood. I had not built a place. I had built a service. They did not love the man carrying the weight. They loved that the weight was carried. I walked to my truck, climbed inside, and shut the door. My hands rested on the steering wheel exactly as they had when I arrived, but the man holding it was no longer the same. I did not start the engine immediately. Through the dining room window, I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Logan's outline appeared briefly, then vanished. I wondered whether he was defending me now that I was gone. Perhaps he was telling Madison she had gone too far. Perhaps he was apologizing to everyone for the scene. But even if he was, it no longer mattered. Courage that arrives after the wounded man leaves is not courage. It is cleanup. I drove home in silence. The road south stretched beneath a sky so wide it made every human problem seem ridiculous. Pine forests passed on either side. Lakes flashed between the trees. Cars moved around me, carrying families toward lunches, shopping trips, and ordinary Sunday obligations. My phone remained dark. No call from Logan. No message. Not even a weak apology. By the time I reached Boise, the hurt had changed. It was no longer sharp. It had become cold. Cold pain is dangerous because it does not demand release. It does not make a man shout or break things. It settles inside him and begins rearranging the furniture of his life. I parked in my driveway as evening settled over the neighborhood. The house felt larger when I entered, every room carrying the stillness of a place built for someone who had learned to live alone. I hung my jacket by the door, set my keys on the counter. Then I sat at the kitchen table where I had once opened Logan's college acceptance letters. For a long time, I did nothing. I remembered the first truck, the wedding, the mortgage office, the way Logan had called me dad whenever he needed help. Memory is cruel when it finally loses its disguise. Every loving moment began to look like evidence. Every promise sounded conditional. I wondered when my son had stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as financial infrastructure. Maybe the change had happened slowly. Maybe Madison had encouraged it. Maybe it had always been there, hidden beneath gratitude that appeared only when he needed something. I would never know. What I did know was simpler. The humiliation at that table had not been an accident. Madison had prepared it. Logan had permitted it. And I had financed the house where it happened. That thought stayed with me until after midnight. I slept badly. At dawn, I made coffee and carried it into my small home office. The room contained decades of my life in labeled folders. Tax returns, retirement statements, insurance policies, loan documents. I opened the filing cabinet. The mortgage agreement was exactly where I had left it. My signature appeared beside Logan's on page after page. There it was in black ink, the proof that his home rested partly on my reputation, my credit, and the years I had spent building both. I traced my finger across my name. Warren Holloway, the toxic father. The man everyone supposedly knew was impossible to love. Yet my name had been good enough for the bank. Good enough for the wedding venue. Good enough whenever taxes came due. Good enough to save them. Just not good enough to defend. At 8 o'clock, I called my attorney. I told him I wanted to understand every legal and financial obligation still connecting me to Logan and Madison. I wanted my name removed wherever removal was possible. I wanted every automatic transfer stopped. Every informal promise ended. Every burden returned to the people who had accepted the benefit while despising the man who provided it. My attorney was quiet for several seconds. Did something happen? I looked through the office window at the empty street. Yes, I said. I finally listened to them. After that, I called the bank. I did not make threats. I did not send Logan a warning. I did not demand an apology before a deadline. An apology extracted by fear of losing money would have meant nothing. I simply began the process. Forms were requested. Documents were reviewed. Appointments were scheduled. The loan officer explained that removing a guarantor could trigger a complete reassessment of the mortgage. Logan and Madison might need to refinance. Their interest rate could change. Their income and credit would have to stand without mine. I understood every consequence. For once, I did not protect them from one.
Before ending the call, the loan officer asked whether I was certain. I looked again at my signature on those pages. Then I remembered Logan staring into his coffee while his wife destroyed my name. I've never been more certain. When the call ended, I sat alone in the quiet office. I did not feel victorious. I felt empty. But beneath that emptiness was something I had not experienced in years. Relief. If I was truly the poison in their lives, I would remove myself completely, not only from their table, from beneath their house.